My name is Venus Garcia, and if you have ever felt the sting of being measured against the wrong yardstick, you will understand what I lived through. I was born into a world where love was weighed in numbers, where dinner conversations were less about memories and more about market shares. My father believed success was the only language worth speaking, and my sister learned to echo every syllable. I grew up studying their approval like it was scripture, convinced that if I could just shine a little brighter, I would be worthy of their pride. But life has a way of testing the foundations we stand on. When I chose Michael, a man with soil under his nails and honesty in his eyes, my family decided my worth had expired. The whispers started quietly behind crystal glasses and chandeliers, but they grew into stories told as entertainment at country clubs and boardrooms. I became the cautionary tale, the daughter who had traded a dynasty for dirt. For years I told myself I could bear it, that the distance was proof I had chosen love over performance. But the truth is, the wound never closed. It burned at holidays when invitations arrived late or not at all. It echoed in the silence when my daughter was born and no one from my family came to the hospital. It sharpened each time I caught my own reflection and wondered if they were right about me. Yet somewhere in that ache, a fire began to grow, because rejection has a strange gift hidden inside it. It strips away the illusions, the masks, the borrowed approval, until all that is left is who you truly are. And that truth, however painful, is what carried me to the night everything changed. All of that history came rushing back on one cold Christmas Eve. Snow crunched beneath my boots as Michael and I crossed the long stone path toward my parents' estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The house glowed like a cathedral against the black December sky, its tall windows spilling gold light across the manicured lawn. From a distance it looked warm, welcoming even, but my stomach had been in knots all day. Christmas Eve in my family was never about comfort. It was a performance, a gathering of the wealthy and powerful. And tonight, I was walking straight back into the fire I had left years ago. Michael's hand brushed mine as we climbed the front steps. He wore his only tailored suit, the one I had saved up for when we got married, and his broad shoulders filled it with quiet confidence. He leaned closer and whispered that everything would be fine. I nodded, though we both knew neither of us believed it. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble floors and chandeliers, heavy enough to crush anyone foolish enough to stand beneath them. A string quartet played in the corner, their music competing with the chatter of bankers, lawyers, and politicians who had known me since childhood. Most looked up as I entered, their smiles polite, but edged with curiosity, as if wondering why the prodigal daughter had returned. My mother approached first, her sequined gown catching the light. She kissed me on both cheeks, her perfume sharp and floral. I caught the hesitation in her eyes before she turned to Michael, offering him the barest of smiles. She guided us towards the main hall, where 100 guests mingled under garlands of evergreen and strands of white lights that wrapped the ceiling beams, and there he was. My father stood in the center of the room, whiskey glass in hand, his gray hair immaculate, his voice booming over the crowd. Richard Montrose, 65, still commanding every space he entered. He had once been the man I worshipped, the man I studied late into the night to impress, but he was also the man who had cut me down without hesitation when I chose love over legacy. He noticed me almost instantly. The corner of his mouth curled, and he raised his glass high as if presenting me like a curiosity. Conversation around him slowed, heads turning. My heart raced, but I forced my spine straight and walked forward with Michael beside me. Richard's voice carried easily across the room. He told Frank Romano, the car dealer whose showroom smelled of leather and oil, that his youngest daughter had arrived. She, he said with mock pride, had traded Harvard's ivory towers for an Iowa cornfield. His words sliced through the music, deliberate, cruel. She thought marrying a farmer made her an entrepreneur. She thought love would pay her bills. The laughter that followed felt like glass shattering in my chest. I wanted to vanish. My palms ached from clenching the clutch I carried, my knuckles white. Michael shifted beside me, ready to defend me, but I pressed my hand to his arm. If he spoke, my father would only turn the blade sharper. Silence was the only shield I had left. I kept my eyes fixed on the garland-wrapped mantle, refusing to let him see me break. Still, the heat of humiliation crawled up my neck. The faces around me blurred, whispers threading between sips of champagne. I heard words like foolish and wasteful and poor choice, though I could not tell if they were actually spoken or simply echoing in my mind. Then came the final cut. Richard announced that his daughter no longer carried the Montrose name, with pride that she had chosen a path unworthy of the family's legacy. The words landed heavy, final, and I felt the air leave my lungs. My vision swam, but I forced myself to breathe, to stand still, to endure. And then I saw her, Sophia, my younger sister, standing near the dessert table in a dress that shimmered like silver. She was only 4 years younger, but tonight she looked like a polished reflection of everything I had abandoned. Her eyes met mine, and instead of sympathy, she smiled. Not kindly, not even neutrally, but with a flicker of amusement that told me she agreed with every word our father had said. She lifted her glass in a mock toast, and her laughter, soft but sharp, joined his. It cut deeper than my father's cruelty. I had expected Richard's disdain, but from Sophia, I had once hoped for loyalty. That hope dissolved in a single glance, leaving me hollow. Michael shifted again, his jaw tight, but I gripped his arm harder. My pride demanded that I not flee, not give them the satisfaction of watching me collapse. Instead, I nodded politely to a passing guest, my smile brittle, and pretended I belonged. Inside, I was shaking. My heart thudded in my ears, my breath shallow, but I refused to cry. Not here, not now. The quartet swelled into another carol, laughter and chatter rose again, and the moment passed as though nothing had happened. My father turned back to his circle of admirers. Sophia leaned in to whisper to a friend, and I stood in the middle of it all, a silent target left standing after the shot was fired. I excused myself under the pretense of needing air, Michael following close behind. Outside, the cold bit my skin sharp and bracing, but I welcomed it. I looked up at the sky stars faint against the glow of the estate, and tried to steady my breath. Michael wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close, his warmth the only thing anchoring me. I told myself I would not let them see me broken. I had made my choice years ago, and I would live with it. But as the laughter and music spilled through the windows behind me, the sting of my father's words and my sister's smirk lingered, echoing louder than the carols. I stood there a long time staring at the frozen lawn, knowing that this night would not fade quietly into memory. It was a wound that would mark the beginning of something I could not yet name. I thought about the Christmases of my childhood, the way I used to run through these same halls in red slippers, clutching gifts I had carefully wrapped for my parents, hoping they would be proud of me. Back then I believed love was simple, that if I worked hard and followed the rules I would always belong. But standing in the cold now with Michael's steady hand in mine, I realized belonging had always been conditional. My father's approval, Sophia's companionship, even my mother's gentle smile, all depended on whether I played the role they scripted for me. The moment I stepped off that stage, I had been cast out. That truth settled deep in my bones, heavy but clarifying. I no longer wanted their stage or their spotlight. What I wanted was my own life, even if tonight reminded me just how costly that decision had been. The first time I saw Michael was not in a ballroom or at a dinner table, polished with silver, but in a church basement in Des Moines, Iowa. It was the summer of 2013, and I had joined a volunteer group from Harvard to help repair storm-damaged homes. I was halfway through my MBA program, my future mapped out like a straight road stretching toward Wall Street. That trip was supposed to be a small detour, a line on my resume that would show empathy to future employers. But then I walked into that basement and saw him handing out boxed lunches to families who had lost everything. His hair was damp from the rain, his boots caked with mud, and yet he smiled with such unshakable kindness that I forgot to breathe for a moment. I watched the way children clung to his sleeves, how elders thanked him with teary eyes, and I realized he was not there for credit or prestige. He was simply there because people needed him. I introduced myself awkwardly after the shift ended, brushing dust from my jeans. He laughed softly when I stumbled over my words. Michael told me he had grown up in Iowa, that he ran a modest farm a few hours outside town. He said volunteering felt natural because neighbors had always helped one, another where he came from. It was not charity to him, it was life. I should have recognized the danger right then. My father had raised me to measure worth in degrees and titles, not in kindness or calloused hands, but I could not help myself. I returned to the site every day, drawn to Michael like a moth to a quiet flame. We worked side by side, hauling debris, painting walls, delivering groceries. In the evenings, when the rest of the group went back to the hotel, Michael would drive me in his old pickup to fields that stretched endlessly beneath the stars. He showed me the constellations I had only seen in textbooks. For the first time in years, I felt like a person, not a resume in progress. By the end of that summer, my plans began to unravel. I no longer cared about the consulting firm that had promised me an internship. I wanted mornings that smelled of soil and evenings filled with laughter over a simple meal. I wanted Michael. When I returned to Cambridge in the fall, I tried to focus. I told myself I could have both Harvard and Michael. For a few months, I balanced them like fragile glass. Weekend flights to Iowa, hurried phone calls between classes, nights staring at spreadsheets while my heart wandered to the Midwest. But the truth grew heavier each day. I was not living two lives. I was betraying one for the other. The breaking point came in early 2014. I had flown home to Greenwich for spring break. My father was hosting a dinner with his business partners, and I arrived late, fresh from a call with Michael. My smile must have given me away because Richard narrowed his eyes the moment I entered. After the guests left, he summoned me to his study, the room where my entire childhood had been measured in grades and trophies. He asked about Harvard. I confessed I was falling behind, that my focus had shifted. I told him about Michael. His face turned the color of storm clouds. He asked if I was seriously considering throwing away an MBA for a man who tilled corn. His voice sharpened with every word until it struck like a whip. I tried to explain that Michael was not just a farmer. He was steady, intelligent, and good. He made me feel whole in ways no degree could. My father laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the mahogany shelves. He said I was blind, that love was fleeting, but prestige was permanent. The argument spiraled until my mother hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands. My father's voice thundered. If I left Harvard, he said, I would no longer be the pride of the Garcia family. I would not carry his name with honor. He told me I was free to choose, but my choice would sever me from everything he had built. I remember standing there, my hands trembling but my voice steady. I told him I had already made my choice. Silence fell for a moment, thick and suffocating. Then he turned his back to me, pouring another drink. His dismissal was final. That night I sat on my childhood bed, staring at the walls lined with framed certificates. Each one felt like a relic of a life that no longer belonged to me. I booked a one-way ticket to Iowa with money I had saved from tutoring. I knew there would be no going back. The following weeks were a blur. I withdrew from Harvard, signed the forms with a shaking hand, and mailed them without telling anyone. When the confirmation arrived, I cried not from regret but from release. I packed my car with clothes books and a small box of jewelry my grandmother had left me. Everything else I left behind. Driving west along the interstate, I felt both terror and exhilaration. My father's words rang in my head like a curse, but Michael's voice, calm and steady, guided me forward. When I finally arrived at his farm, the fields were greening with spring. He met me at the edge of the driveway, dirt on his hands, and pulled me into his arms as though I had always belonged there. For a while, I let myself believe love would be enough to fill the gap my family had carved. Open. I thought time might soften my father's anger, that Sophia might still call, that my mother might one day forgive me. But deep down, I knew the price had already been set. I had chosen Michael, and in doing so, I had lost them. I looked at him that evening. His eyes crinkled with joy as he showed me the calves born that spring, and I told myself it was worth it. It had to be. The drive itself felt like crossing an invisible border between two versions of myself. Every mile carried me farther from the glass towers and lecture halls that had defined my identity and closer to a world most of my classmates would never even think about. I stopped at a gas station somewhere in Ohio and caught sight of my reflection in the restroom mirror. My blazer looked out of place, my nails still manicured from the last networking event I had attended. For a moment I doubted everything. I heard my father's voice, sharp and unforgiving, reminding me that I was throwing away a legacy. But then I remembered the nights under the Iowa sky with Michael, the way the stars had felt endless, the way he made me laugh at myself when I grew too serious. I thought about the families we had helped, their gratitude simple and unadorned, and how alive I had felt working beside him. That memory steadied me. Crossing into Iowa, the landscape stretched wide and open, the fields bare but waiting for spring. The air seemed clearer somehow, as if I had been holding my breath for years and was finally able to exhale. By the time I reached Michael's driveway, dust trailing behind my car, I knew there would be no turning back. I might have lost the approval of my father, but in its place, I had found something more real than I had ever known. The first weeks after our wedding felt like stepping into a world stripped of everything familiar. Iowa stretched wide and flat in every direction, the horizon broken only by bare trees and old barns leaning against the wind. The farmhouse Michael inherited from his grandparents creaked with every gust. Its paint faded, its roof patched more times than I cared to count. But it was ours, and when I carried my small box of books inside, I tried to imagine a life being built here from the ground up. At night, when the furnace groaned and the wind rattled the windows, I would lie awake listening to Michael breathe beside me. We had nothing except each other, but I told myself that would be enough. I had left behind the marble floors and chandeliers of Greenwich, the security of my father's wealth, the comfort of knowing I would never have to worry about the price of bread. Now every dollar mattered, every gallon of gas a decision. The first blow came when the bills piled higher than the checks. Michael sold grain at the co-op, but prices had dropped, and the harvest had not been kind. The numbers never balanced no matter how carefully we added them. I remember the day I placed an ad for my old Honda, the one I had driven since college, the last piece of independence I had clung to. Watching a stranger drive it away felt like surrendering the final proof that I had once belonged to a different life. Michael apologized over and over, but I told him it was fine, that a car was just metal. What mattered was us. Still, when the headlights disappeared down the gravel road, I cried in the kitchen where he could not see. The neighbors did not make it easier. At church potlucks, I caught the sidelong glances, the whispered jokes about the city girl who thought she could play farmer's wife. When I showed up with a store-bought pie because I had run out of flour, their smiles turned brittle. One woman asked if I missed shopping on Fifth Avenue, her tone as sweet as poison. I smiled back, but the truth was, yes, sometimes I did. Not for the things themselves, but for the simplicity of fitting in, of not being the outsider everyone doubted. Then came the drought. Weeks of heat left the fields brittle and brown, the soil cracked like old leather. Michael spent long hours pacing the edge of the cornfields, his hands in his hair, calculating losses he never voiced but I could see etched on his face. I tried to help hauling water, tending what little we had in the garden, but every effort felt small against the weight of the land. When the bank called to remind us of the loan payments, I felt the floor tilt under me. We were drowning. One night I found Michael sitting at the kitchen table long after midnight, his ledger open, the numbers circled in red ink. His shoulders slumped, his face shadowed in the dim light. He looked at me and said he did not know if we could make it another season. The silence after those words pressed down heavier than any storm. I wanted to scream to demand why fate had given us only hardship, but instead I placed my hands over his and told him we would endure. My voice shook, but I meant it. That summer was the closest we came to breaking. The fields yielded little, the bills stacked higher, and even our laughter thinned to a fragile thing. But in the middle of that despair, something shifted. Anna Rivera, my best friend from college, arrived unannounced one sticky afternoon in July. She drove up in a rental car, her heels sinking into the gravel as she hurried to hug me. Seeing her felt like a doorway opening to a part of myself I had locked away. She took one look at the peeling paint of the farmhouse, at Michael's sweat-stained shirt, and then turned to me with eyes that softened instead of judging. We sat on the porch, drinking iced tea from mismatched glasses while the cicadas droned in the trees. Anna listened as I told her about selling the car, about the whispers at church, about the harvest that might ruin us. She never interrupted, never tried to fix it. She only held my hand and told me she believed in me, that she always had. Those words, simple as they were, lit a spark I did not realize I had been missing. For weeks I had felt like the world saw me as a failure, my father's predictions proven right. But Anna's faith in me was real steady, and it gave me something solid to cling to. When she left 2 days later, pressing a folded note into my palm with her hotel address scribbled on it, I felt a small piece of strength return. She had no money to solve our problems, no magic to change the weather, but she reminded me that I was not invisible, that someone still saw me as more than a mistake. That night, as Michael and I sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the fields, I felt the weight of the day lift just slightly. We were still on the edge of ruin, but for the first time in months, I believed that maybe somehow we could hold on long enough for something to change. The summer air was heavy, the future uncertain, but as I leaned my head against Michael's shoulder, I let the quiet hope settle in. It was fragile, but it was ours. And for now, that had to be enough. But hope was fragile, and the smallest crack could shatter it. A week later, the storm we had prayed for finally came, but it came wrong. Rain hammered the fields in torrents, washing away the soil we had fought to preserve. I watched from the window as water carved rivers through the corn rows, carrying with it not just the crop, but months of sweat and faith. Michael ran outside in the downpour, trying to dig trenches with a shovel, mud splashing up his legs. I rushed to join him, the rain stinging my face, but it was useless. Nature was stronger than both of us. When we came back inside, drenched and defeated, the silence stretched long and raw. The following morning, the bank called again, this time with a sharper tone. Words like foreclosure and deadlines seeped into our kitchen like poison. Michael's hand shook as he hung up the phone, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He had always been my rock, the one who stood steady when everything else swayed. But now he looked like a man cracking under the weight of a dream. That night, lying awake in the dark, I wondered if my father's words had been a prophecy. He said I would regret leaving Harvard, regret choosing love over legacy. Was he right? The thought burned, not because I believed him, but because I feared someday Michael might. I reached for his hand beneath the blanket, gripping it tightly as if to anchor us both. We had chosen this life together, and I refused to believe it was meant only for suffering. still as the wind howled outside and the roof groaned. I could not silence the doubt echoing in my chest. The year after the drought began with silence. The land outside lay bare, the fields stripped, and the air carried the heaviness of failure. Michael spent long nights at the kitchen table poring over books and articles, pages filled with sketches of irrigation systems and notations about soil health. He scribbled equations on scrap paper, crumpled them up, and started again. I often woke in the middle of the night to find him hunched over a laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his tired face. At first, I thought he was torturing himself, refusing to let go of a dream that was draining us. But then I noticed the glimmer in his eyes when he explained what he was learning. He spoke about sustainable farming, about harnessing renewable energy and precision planting. Words I barely understood poured from him with a conviction I had not seen since the day we married. For the first time in months, he sounded alive. I started keeping notes of my own, recording his ideas, collecting articles, sketching budgets. My background in economics, the one thing I had not abandoned, began to surface again. If he could make this vision work, maybe I could find a way to turn it into more than survival. We gave it a name one night over dinner at the scarred wooden table: Green Harvest. The word felt strange in my mouth, fragile but hopeful, as if speaking it could make it real. But when we shared the idea with others, the response was not kind. The men at the co-op laughed when Michael explained his vision of using sensors to track soil moisture. One of them slapped his back and asked if he thought he was running NASA instead of a farm. Another said people had been farming the same way for generations, and that no machine was going to change the weather. Their laughter echoed as we drove home, Michael's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. I felt the sting too, but I refused to let it settle. Every entrepreneur faces ridicule before they are taken seriously, I told him. He gave me a weary smile, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. I began calling old classmates, acquaintances who had moved into finance, anyone who might listen. Most brushed me off politely, some not politely at all. A few said they admired my passion, but that agriculture was too risky, too old-fashioned, too slow. One even asked if I was still trying to prove my father wrong. That one cut deep. Weeks stretched into months. Our savings dwindled as we poured money into prototype solar panels and testing soil sensors. Some days I wondered if we were being reckless, if we were chasing a mirage. Yet every time Michael showed me a graph where the data aligned, where the soil responded exactly as he predicted, I believed again. The turning point came in the most unexpected way. We were at a small community event, presenting Green Harvest to a room of less than 20 people. The audience consisted mostly of skeptical farmers, arms crossed, brows furrowed. Michael spoke with quiet intensity, explaining how precise irrigation could save water, how data could predict yields more accurately. I watched faces grow blank, saw heads shake. My chest tightened with familiar disappointment. And then from the back of the room, a man raised his hand. He was middle-aged, dressed simply, his hair silver at the temples. He introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, a retired engineer who had invested in renewable energy projects after leaving his corporate career. He said he had seen ideas like this dismissed before, only to become the backbone of entire industries. Afterward, he pulled us aside. He asked about our plans, our budget, our long-term vision. I explained every detail, my voice trembling but steady. While Michael described the technical side, Daniel listened without interrupting, nodding slowly. Finally, he smiled and said he believed in what we were doing. He would not write a large check, but he would commit $50,000 to help us take the first step. For a moment, I could not breathe. The number was not enough to secure our future, not enough to silence the banks or the skeptics, but it was more than anyone had ever offered us. It was proof that someone somewhere saw the value in what we were building. That night, when Michael and I sat on the porch with the crickets singing in the fields, we let ourselves imagine a different future. We pictured rows of crops thriving under the watchful eyes of our sensors, farmers embracing new methods, investors lining up to be part of the change. For the first time in a long while, the horizon did not look like a wall. It looked like a door. The work ahead would be brutal, and we both knew it. But with Daniel's belief and his small but vital investment, Green Harvest was no longer just a dream whispered across a kitchen table. It had become something real, something alive. And that tiny spark of validation was enough to push us forward into the unknown. In the days that followed Daniel's commitment, the air in our house shifted. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on our shoulders felt lighter, though it had not disappeared. We spread papers across the kitchen table, drawing up new budgets and timelines. Michael mapped out the prototype with a focus that made me fall in love with him all over again, his brow furrowed, his pencil moving quickly across graph paper. I handled the calls, the emails, the outreach, balancing our household bills on one side and our fragile business plan on the other. But not everyone was pleased. Word of Daniel's investment traveled quickly through town, and the whispers began. At the grocery store, I overheard someone say that we were just wasting an old man's money. Another time, a neighbor smirked and asked if we were planning to turn the farm into a science lab. The laughter always stung, but this time I noticed something different. Instead of shrinking, Michael seemed to grow taller, as if every insult only strengthened his resolve. One evening, Daniel visited us again. He walked the fields with Michael until dusk, listening as my husband explained how sensors would change water usage, how drones could track crop health more efficiently than the human eye. When they returned, Daniel shook Michael's hand firmly, telling him he had not seen such grit in years. He looked at me then, saying Green Harvest would only survive if both of us carried it. I nodded because I knew it was true. As the fireflies lit the fields, I realized we were standing at the fragile beginning of something that might define our lives. We had almost nothing, but now for the first time, almost nothing felt like enough to begin. I woke up one morning in early spring of 2017 to the sound of the wind rattling our bedroom window. Michael was already gone, his side of the bed cold, the faint scent of soil clinging to the sheets. By the time I walked into the kitchen, he was sitting at the table with his laptop open and his head in his hands. I knew that posture too well. It meant something had gone wrong. He didn't look up when I asked if he had eaten. His silence was louder than any answer. I poured coffee into his mug and sat across from him, my hands wrapped around the cup for warmth. Finally, he muttered that the prototype sensor had failed again. It wasn't just one glitch. The entire batch we had distributed to trial farms across Iowa was malfunctioning. Instead of reducing water use, the sensors were misreading soil moisture and drowning crops. Farmers who trusted us were furious. That week was the beginning of a collapse I could feel in my bones. Phones rang with complaints we couldn't resolve. Bills piled on the counter thicker every day. I had to dodge messages from suppliers demanding payment while I tried to keep our small team of interns and technicians motivated. Michael buried himself in the fields, testing wires and chips under the blistering sun until his skin turned red. At night, he barely spoke. By summer, the crisis had reached the papers. A local agricultural journal ran a headline calling Green Harvest a costly misstep. Larger outlets picked up the story, laughing at the idea that two dreamers from nowhere thought they could reinvent farming. I sat in the grocery store parking lot one morning, reading an article on my phone that called us a cautionary tale. My chest tightened so hard I had to put my head on the steering wheel just to breathe. We pulled every resource we had to fix the sensors. I even sold the last of my jewelry pieces that had belonged to my grandmother to cover payroll. But no matter how hard we worked, the image was already out there. At a local town hall meeting, a man stood and said he would rather set his fields on fire than use another Green Harvest product. Laughter filled the room. I forced myself to keep a straight face, but the shame burned through me. Michael tried to reassure me at night, but even in his arms I felt the cold wall of despair pressing in. I didn't think of my father then, not directly, but I couldn't ignore the whispers of society. People we once considered peers now looked at us with thin smiles and raised brows. Even Anna, who had been my anchor, grew quiet on the phone, as if she didn't know how to lift me from the weight of humiliation. One evening in late 2018, after another day of fielding angry calls, I found Michael in the barn sitting on an overturned bucket, his hands black with grease from dismantling a faulty unit. His shoulders sagged in a way I had never seen before. I sat beside him, dirt clinging to my jeans, and asked him if we should quit. The words tasted bitter, but I had to say them out loud. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the broken pieces spread across the floor. Then slowly he shook his head. "Not like this," he whispered. Not while we still had a chance to find what was missing. A week later, while cleaning up the piles of reports on his desk, Michael noticed something. The problem wasn't only the hardware. It was the way the sensors were interpreting weather fluctuations. Our models were too rigid, unable to adapt to sudden storms or droughts. He told me, his eyes blazing again, that what we needed was not better wires or stronger chips, but smarter predictions. That night he stayed up until dawn, reading about advances in machine learning and climate modeling. He explained that artificial intelligence could help us process decades of historical weather data along with live satellite feeds to anticipate crop stress before it happened. If we could integrate that into our system, we could prevent the failures that had destroyed us. I listened, torn between exhaustion and hope. Part of me wanted to protect myself from more disappointment, to shut it all down and return to a quieter life. But when I saw the light in his face, the way his voice carried energy again, I knew I couldn't take that from him. The next morning, I sat with him at the kitchen table again, coffee between us, stacks of bills scattered around like reminders of our failures. He pulled out a notebook and began sketching how the data streams would flow, how the sensors could be recalibrated to learn instead of just measure. I took a deep breath and began calculating what little funds we had left, what we could sell, who might still be willing to listen. Outside, the fields stretched wide and bare under the late autumn sky. To anyone else, it looked like ruin, but in Michael's eyes, I saw the faint outline of possibility. For the first time in months, I let myself believe that maybe our story wasn't over yet. The papers still mocked us, the debt was still crushing, and we had almost nothing to lean on but stubbornness. Yet in that fragile moment, surrounded by broken equipment and unpaid bills, I felt a flicker of the same fire that had carried us this far. Something inside me whispered that failure might not be the end, only the soil where the next seed could take root. In the weeks that followed Michael's discovery, our days took on a strange rhythm. By morning, we were still drowning in bad press and overdue invoices. By night, we worked side by side at the dining table like students cramming for an impossible exam. Michael pored over climate data sets, scribbling formulas in the margins of notebooks until the pages tore. I drafted emails to potential partners, most of which went unanswered, yet every rejection seemed to fuel him more. Sometimes, though, the weight of failure pushed hard against us. One freezing December night, the old furnace sputtered and died, leaving the farmhouse cold. We bundled ourselves in coats, sitting close to a small space heater, while Michael explained how AI could detect subtle shifts in temperature before a storm. His voice shook partly from the chill, partly from the fire inside him. I found myself staring at his hands, cracked and scarred from months of fixing machines that refused to cooperate, and wondered how much longer they could hold on. Neighbors still mocked us. At the diner in town, two men laughed loudly about green harvest being nothing more than a science fair project. I kept my head down, but inside I promised myself they wouldn't have the final word. One night, as I closed the laptop after another unanswered pitch, Michael touched my arm and said quietly that failure wasn't our identity, only our teacher. His words sank deep. For the first time, I saw our broken sensors not as tombstones, but as markers on the path toward something bigger. I still remember the smell of damp earth that clung to my boots that spring morning in 2019 when I realized Green Harvest was no longer drowning. The endless months of tweaking software, calibrating sensors, and pitching investors had begun to pay off. A small co-op in Nebraska reported higher yields using our pilot system, and suddenly emails that once went unanswered now came with signatures from agricultural boards and universities. For the first time in years, the bank statements showed black instead of red. Michael's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since our wedding. He walked through the fields with a new energy, talking about expansion and partnerships. I found myself daring to believe again. Nights were still long and full of work, but the exhaustion carried a sweetness I had never felt during the worst days. The first test of our resilience came when a representative from Agrotech International, a massive conglomerate, called requesting a meeting. They invited me to a sleek glass tower in Chicago, where the lobby smelled of money and polished stone. Sitting across from men in dark suits, I listened as they praised our vision, then slid a contract across the table offering to buy us out for a fraction of what I knew we were worth. For a moment, my pulse quickened. That check could pay off our debts, buy security, even silence the laughter of neighbors. But as I looked at the fine print, I realized they didn't care about innovation, only about burying us before we grew too powerful. My voice shook, but I pushed the contract back and told them no. Their smiles thinned, and one of them muttered that people like me rarely got second chances. Driving home through the flat Midwest highways, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Saying no had been terrifying, but for the first time I felt like I owned more than just a company. I owned my choices. Weeks later, an opportunity presented itself that felt like fate disguised in paperwork. A real estate agent I trusted mentioned a plot of land outside Stamford, Connecticut, available through a quiet investment trust. When she showed me the listing, my chest tightened. I knew that land. It was part of the Garcia holdings, the very soil I had once run across as a child before my father decided I was unworthy of his name. The agent explained the trust was managed anonymously, and no one would trace it back to me if I purchased through Green Harvest's investment arm. I signed without hesitation, the pen scratching across the page like a declaration of independence. The first time I walked those acres again, the memories hit hard. I saw my younger self playing beneath the maple trees, heard echoes of my father's voice barking orders at landscapers, remembered the way my sister Sophia had strutted down the gravel paths as if she already owned the world. Now the fields were mine, not through inheritance, but through grit and contracts signed in my own name. Michael didn't question my decision. He knew what it meant without me saying a word. That night, over dinner in our farmhouse kitchen, I admitted I had bought a piece of my past. He reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and told me reclaiming it was the sweetest form of justice. The land was modest compared to the Garcia estate as a whole, but it was symbolic. Every row we planted there, every censer we buried in that soil, felt like stitching a wound I had carried for years. My father had cast me out, but unknowingly, he was now leasing back to me the very ground he once guarded so fiercely. As Green Harvest began generating steady revenue from new contracts, the whispers in town changed. Neighbors who once mocked us now asked for advice. Reporters who once dismissed us as a failed experiment called for interviews. And yet beneath all the growth and noise, the secret of that Connecticut land burned quietly in my chest, a secret weapon waiting for the right moment to be revealed. I did not know then how soon the Garcia name would come crashing back into my life, nor how powerful that hidden purchase would become. But standing there in 2019, with the earth of my childhood pressing into my palms, I finally felt the tide turning in my favor. The first time I drove out alone to see the land in Connecticut, I parked at the edge of the property and just sat in the car for a long time. The gravel crunching under my tires had been the same sound I remembered from childhood, except then it had been under the wheels of my father's Mercedes. I stared at the trees that lined the field, taller now, their roots deeper in the soil I once believed would never belong to me. My chest tightened with something between grief and triumph. I walked slowly, letting my boots sink into the damp earth. The air smelled of pine needles and cold river water. For a moment I saw myself at 12 years old, running after Sophia as she laughed and dared me to keep up, only to have my father call her back and remind her to behave like Garcia, not like her older sister who was always dirtying her clothes. That memory stung, and I pressed my palm against the trunk of an oak tree to steady myself. I thought of how my father used to say the land was the proof of our family's legacy, that blood meant nothing without acreage to back it up. And now here I was, the daughter he had disowned, standing as the legal owner of a parcel he probably still believed was under his control. The irony nearly made me laugh. Michael joined me later that evening, bringing 2 mugs of coffee and a thermos. We sat on a fallen log, steam rising between us as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in orange light. He didn't need me to explain the turmoil written all over my face. He just handed me the mug and said that the past didn't own me anymore. I sipped and tried to believe him, but it wasn't so simple. Every corner of that land carried echoes of voices I had tried to forget. I remembered Christmas mornings spent in the big house, my father holding court while I pretended not to notice how his praise always bypassed me and landed on Sophia. I remembered summer evenings when neighbors gathered, admiring how perfectly the estate looked, unaware of how cold it felt to live there. Now it was different. The grass was overgrown in places, the fences sagging. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I knelt down and picked up a handful of soil, rubbing it between my fingers. It was dark rich, alive in a way the manicured lawns of my childhood never were. I whispered to myself that this dirt had no loyalty to anyone's name, only to the hands that worked it. The thought steadied me. I began to see the land not just as a symbol of pain, but as an opportunity. If Green Harvest could thrive here on Garcia soil, it would be more than profit, it would be proof. Proof that I didn't need my father's approval, his money, or his name. When I left that night, the moon was high and the headlights cut through the gravel road. I glanced back once before turning onto the main highway. The fields looked almost silver under the light, quiet and waiting. I promised myself I would come back, not as the girl who had once been humiliated on those grounds, but as the woman who had built something strong enough to root there forever. Driving away, I realized I no longer felt like a trespasser. For the first time in my life, the land had greeted me as its rightful owner, and I carried that knowledge with me like armor. Whatever storm was waiting ahead, I knew I had reclaimed a piece of myself, and that no one, not even Richard Garcia, could take it back. The phone rang late on a Sunday evening, the kind of call that carries dread before you even answer. I saw my father's name flash across the screen, and for a moment, I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but I pressed accept, my hand tight around the phone as if bracing for impact. His voice was cold-clipped, like he was addressing an employee who had disappointed him. He said he had heard more than enough about Green Harvest's so-called recovery, but in his circles, the story was already set. To them, I was the daughter who had squandered opportunity, the one who traded Harvard for cornfields and ended up humiliated. He warned me that if I continued down this path, he would erase my name from the will entirely. I told him I had never counted on his money, but my voice wavered just enough for him to chuckle and hang up. For days after, the sound of his laughter replayed in my head like a broken record. Every gala, every fundraiser, every garden party in Connecticut whispered with my name attached. I caught wind of it through old acquaintances, people who couldn't resist repeating what they had overheard. They called me the poor daughter, the one who had married a farmer and sunk into obscurity. Some even suggested my father was right to cut ties, that I had always been too soft to survive in the real world. I pretended not to care, but each comment stuck like a thorn under my skin. Michael noticed my silence over dinners. He reached for my hand, telling me the gossip didn't matter, that truth would rise above noise. I smiled for him, but inside I burned. The same community that once invited me to their daughters' weddings and charity luncheons now mocked me like I was entertainment. The cruelest part was how easily they believed it all. They didn't ask about the nights we spent in freezing barns, fixing broken machinery, or the mornings I woke up before dawn to send proposals to investors who would never answer. They only wanted a neat story of failure to pass around their tables. Sophia's distance grew sharper during this time. She stopped replying to my texts, then declined my calls altogether. When we did meet at family events I couldn't avoid, her smile was all teeth and no warmth. She echoed my father's words sometimes in subtle jabs, sometimes in outright mockery. She asked if I ever regretted leaving behind a real life for the fantasy of being a farmer's wife. I told her Green Harvest was building something real, but she just laughed and said I sounded desperate. One evening, sitting in my office with papers scattered across the desk, I opened a news article that made my stomach twist. A new agricultural startup had been making waves, boasting about sustainable technology that sounded suspiciously similar to ideas Michael and I had once pitched. The CEO was a polished young man with the kind of connections that opened doors we had to pry at with bloody fingers. At the bottom of the article in the list of key advisors, I saw a familiar name, Sofia Garcia. My pulse was hammered. I scrolled through the company's website, my eyes devouring every detail. There she was smiling in a press photo, described as a strategic consultant bringing family legacy and insight into agricultural innovation. It felt like betrayal layered over betrayal, not only because she had dismissed my work for years, but because now she was aligning herself with competitors who were circling us like vultures. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece it together. Had she been feeding them information? Was this why she had shown sudden interest in my projects during those rare conversations, asking questions that at the time seemed casual? My chest tightened with anger, but beneath it was a familiar ache, the kind that came from blood ties snapping one by one. The Connecticut elite already saw me as the failure. If Sophia succeeded with them, it would cement that story forever. My father would beam, the community would nod in approval, and I would be nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. That night I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window, watching the lights of the barn across the yard where Michael worked late into the night. Part of me wanted to run to him to spill everything I had discovered, but I kept it inside. Not out of shame, but because I needed to be sure before dragging him into the storm that was my family. The betrayal cut deeper than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just about business. It was about being erased, replaced, and ridiculed by the very people who had promised to love me unconditionally. And now I knew for certain the war wasn't only with outsiders who doubted me. It was within my own bloodline, and Sophia had just drawn her sword. The next week, I forced myself to attend a charity dinner in Greenwich, even though every part of me wanted to stay home. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished silver, but the air was thick with judgment. Conversations hushed when I walked past, then rose again with the faint sound of laughter. I could feel eyes on the back of my dress measuring its simplicity, contrasting it with Sophia's designer gown across the room. She stood near my father, radiant in their approval, as if she were the true heir while I had become the family embarrassment. I tried to smile to hold my posture, but every word I overheard seemed designed to cut. A woman I had once considered a friend whispered that it was tragic, the way I had wasted potential. Another said I was only hanging on to Green Harvest because I couldn't admit failure. Their words clung to me like smoke, impossible to brush off. Richard barely acknowledged me. When he did, it was a glance so brief it felt rehearsed, as though he didn't want others to see us as connected. Sophia, however, made her role clear. She toasted with a group of investors, proudly announcing her advisory work with the rival startup as if she wanted me to hear it. The room applauded and I felt heat rise to my face. I slipped out to the terrace where the winter air bit at my skin, sharp and unforgiving. I leaned against the stone railing, trying to steady my breath. For a moment, I thought of leaving entirely, disappearing back to Iowa where the air was cleaner and the judgments quieter. But then I caught sight of Sophia through the glass doors, her laughter bright and effortless, and something shifted inside me. I realized this wasn't just about surviving anymore. It wasn't enough to prove to strangers that I could succeed. I needed to reclaim my name, not because I wanted their approval, but because I refused to let them rewrite the story of who I was. The land I had bought, the company we had built, the nights of struggle that no one cared to see, those were mine, and they carried a truth deeper than any gossip. I turned back toward the ballroom, squaring my shoulders. The night wasn't over, and neither was the fight. If Sophia thought aligning herself with my enemies would bury me, she had underestimated just how much I had already endured. I had walked away from everything once, and I had learned how to build from ashes. I could do it again, but this time I would make sure the fire spread far enough for them to feel it too. The letter arrived on a gray February morning, thick paper with a gold-embossed seal that made my stomach tighten before I even tore it open. Inside was the news I had dreaded but half expected. Richard, alongside Sophia, had joined forces with Sterling Agritech, the same corporation that once tried to buy us out, and now they were suing Green Harvest over our right to use the Garcia land. The land I had leased legally, the soil where our new generation of climate-resilient crops had finally begun to flourish. The world seemed to tilt as I read their accusations. They claimed fraud, manipulation, even betrayal. My own name was written in cold, sterile legal language as if I were a stranger to them. I sat frozen at my kitchen table in Des Moines, the winter sun stretching across the hardwood floor, while the papers cut into my hands like glass. When I called Michael, my voice shook. He listened calm as always, but I could hear the edge beneath his words. We knew this was no longer just a business dispute. This was personal, a family war dragged into the public square. He told me to call Mark Stevens, the attorney who had guided us through every difficult contract since the early days. Mark's office smelled of leather and old law books. He listened intently as I laid out the papers, his sharp eyes narrowing with every line he read. He assured me the lease had been airtight, vetted, and above board. Still, he warned, Richard's influence in Connecticut's upper circles would make the battle brutal. The months leading up to the trial felt like moving through quicksand. Reporters circled our farm, snapping photos of me in jeans and muddy boots, then contrasting them with Sophia's polished appearances in Manhattan. The press called it a family feud fit for tabloids, and every headline carved a little deeper into my resolve. Investors grew restless, suppliers wary, and at night I lay awake listening to the wind rattle the bare trees, wondering how much more I could lose. The courthouse in Hartford loomed tall and cold on the morning of the hearing. Reporters clustered at the steps, their microphones thrust forward as cameras flashed. I walked through them with Mark at my side, my pulse thundering in my ears. Inside, the air was heavy with whispers, the gallery filled with familiar faces from Greenwich society. They had come not for justice, but for spectacle. Richard sat at the opposing table, his posture rigid, his gray suit perfectly pressed. Sophia was beside him, her expression cool, her lips barely curved in the faintest smile. I forced myself to meet their eyes, but inside my chest ached. This was my father, and yet he looked at me as if I were his enemy. The proceedings began with Sterling's attorneys painting me as reckless and deceitful, a daughter desperate to cling to relevance by exploiting family land that wasn't truly mine to use. Each word was designed to humiliate, and the audience shifted in their seats, hanging on every syllable. When it was our turn, Mark rose with steady composure. He laid out the lease agreement, each clause highlighted, each signature notarized, every payment documented. His voice was sharp, confident, and unyielding. He reminded the court that the land had been transferred into a trust years before, and I had secured the lease through an independent investment group. Every move had been legal, transparent, and binding. Richard's face tightened as Mark produced documents bearing not only my signature but his own, proof that he had been informed of the transaction through the trust and had chosen to ignore it. A murmur rippled through the gallery, the sharp sound of whispered judgment filling the air. I sat frozen, my hands clasped together to keep from trembling. My father's eyes flickered just for a moment, with something I had not seen in years. Not anger, not disappointment, shame. The judge's questions grew sharper, pressing Sterling's attorneys into corners they couldn't escape. Mark's quiet satisfaction radiated beside me, but I couldn't celebrate yet. I only stared at Richard, wondering if he felt even a fraction of the weight that had crushed me for so long. When the session adjourned for the day, reporters swarmed again, hungry for reactions. Sophia slipped through them with ease, her hand gripping Richard's arm, her chin high. I stepped into the cold air, my breath clouding before me. I was exhausted, yet a strange clarity settled in. For years I had chased my father's approval, fought against whispers, endured humiliation to prove myself. But here, under the judgment of strangers, I realized I no longer needed his recognition. The fight wasn't about his name anymore, it was about mine. I turned away from the cameras, letting their questions fade into the winter wind. The trial was far from over, but the tide had shifted. For the first time, Richard could no longer pretend I was the foolish daughter playing at business. The truth had been spoken aloud in front of the world, and it had left him exposed. As I walked toward this waiting car, I felt a heaviness lift. Whatever came next, I knew I had already won something far greater than the land. I had stood my ground, and he had seen it. The second day of the hearing carried a sharper edge, as if everyone sensed we were reaching the heart of it. The courtroom was crowded, every seat filled with journalists, society members from Greenwich, and curious locals who wanted to witness a Sullivan family implosion. My hands were clammy as I adjusted my blazer, trying to keep my face calm even though my stomach churned. Sterling's lead attorney stood tall, his voice booming with certainty as he waved a stack of papers. He painted me as opportunistic, a woman who had slipped into legal loopholes to grab what was never rightfully mine. He pointed to my marriage, to my so-called rural reinvention, even to my lack of ties with the family trust as proof I didn't belong. Every word was calculated to reduce me, to drag me back into the shadow Richard had always cast. I stole a glance at my father. He didn't look at me. He kept his gaze on the attorney, his jaw tight, his hand tapping against the table as though he could hold the narrative to hold. Sophia sat close, whispering occasionally, her eyes darting toward me with a gleam that looked like satisfaction. Then it was Mark's turn. He rose with deliberate calm, smoothing the front of his suit before approaching the bench. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. He went line by line, clause by clause, peeling away the accusations until the room itself seemed to lean toward him. He presented evidence of the lease through the Garcia Trust, tracing the timeline, the signatures, the payments. He introduced testimonies from the investment group, showing how every step had been reviewed and cleared. The real blow came when he presented internal memos from Sterling itself, documents we had obtained through discovery. They revealed that Sterling's executives had been fully aware of the legality of my lease but had decided to pursue litigation anyway, believing that the scandal of a family feud would weaken me. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the judge raised his eyebrows. I finally dared to look at Richard. His face had gone pale, the hand that had been tapping now clenched in a fist on the table. Sophia leaned in to whisper again, but he didn't respond. For the first time, he looked old to me, not untouchable, not towering, just a man cornered by his own pride. When the session broke, reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, questions flying. I walked past them without answering, my heels clicking on the marble floor, my heart pounding. Outside, the cold air bit at my cheeks, but it felt bracing alive. Michael caught up with me, his hand brushing mine for a moment of steady warmth. We didn't speak much on the drive back. The silence wasn't heavy, though. It was the quiet that comes when a storm begins to break, when the air feels cleared for the first time in years. I didn't know yet what the final ruling would be, but as I stared out the window at the winter fields rolling past, I knew the balance had shifted. Whatever Richard decided to throw at me next, he could never erase what the world had already seen: his daughter standing, unbroken in the face of his attempt to destroy her. The morning green harvest went public felt unreal, as if I had stepped into a life that wasn't mine. Michael and I stood on the balcony overlooking Times Square, watching the giant screen flash our company's ticker symbol in bold letters. The crowd below cheered as the first numbers rolled in, the stock climbing faster than I had dared to imagine. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and for a moment all I could do was hold Michael's hand and let the sound wash over me. We had fought through years of doubt, humiliation, and near collapse, yet here we were. Green Harvest wasn't just surviving, it was soaring. By the end of the day, the company was valued in the billions, and our personal stake was worth close to $2 billion. My chest tightened not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of it. That evening, Michael and I sat in a quiet corner of our hotel suite, champagne glasses in hand, watching the news replay the day's highlights. Anchor after anchor called it one of the most successful agricultural tech IPOs in a decade. They called us pioneers. They called me visionary. I thought back to the nights when we could barely keep the heat on in Iowa, when I had sold my old car just to cover bills. I had carried those moments like stones in my pocket, and now they felt lighter, almost weightless. The phone didn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in from colleagues, former classmates, even strangers. Among them was a name that caught my eye, David Lee, a journalist known for his sharp takes on business and society. I opened his article and read in stunned silence as he described my journey, from the so-called farmer's wife mocked by high society to a self-made billionaire. His headline declared that I had become the newest member of the Forbes 400. My throat tightened as I reread the words. Michael leaned over my shoulder, his arm around me. You did it, Venus. They finally see you. But it wasn't just me, it was us. Every sleepless night, every field we had walked, every risk we had taken had led here. Still, I knew how much this would sting my father. Richard had spent years telling anyone who would listen that I wasn't worthy of his name. Now the world was celebrating the daughter he had cast aside. Sure enough, the calls came quickly. Reporters wanted a comment from Richard Garcia. Some even camped outside the gates of the estate in Connecticut, waiting for a statement. From what I heard, he stayed silent, refusing to face the swarm. Silence, however, said enough. For once, he didn't have the words to diminish me. Sophia, on the other hand, couldn't stay quiet. She went on television the next day, her voice sharp, her smile brittle. She accused me of abandoning the family, of betraying my roots for profit. She claimed Green Harvest's technology was exaggerated and unsustainable, that I had manipulated investors with polished marketing. But the public wasn't buying it. Analysts dismantled her claims within hours, pointing to the success of our pilot programs and the undeniable demand driving the stock. Worse for her, whispers began to circulate about her own startup. Competitors revealed her financial missteps, and journalists dug into questionable partnerships. The same media that once applauded her for being the smart Garcia daughter now turned on her, dissecting her failures in headlines that grew uglier by the day. I should have felt triumphant, but when I watched Sophia's interviews unravel, I felt something heavier. There she was lashing out, clinging to relevance, while the ground beneath her was crumbling. I thought of the Christmas night she had stood by Richard's side, laughing as he humiliated me in front of strangers. I thought of the distance that had stretched between us since childhood, widened by choices neither of us could undo. The collapse of her company came swiftly. Within weeks, investors pulled out, employees resigned, and regulators began circling. I read the announcement in the Wall Street Journal one morning over coffee. The words stark and final. Sophia's company had filed for bankruptcy. Michael set his mug down and reached across the table to touch my hand. Are you okay? I nodded, though my chest was tight. I should feel relieved, maybe even vindicated, but it just feels sad. He studied me quietly. You can't control what she chose. All you did was build something real. The truth was, karma had found its mark. Sophia had tried to ride our family name and align with those who sought to tear me down, but in the end her own ambition had consumed her. Later that evening, as the city lights blinked outside our window, I let myself breathe. The world had shifted. Green Harvest was no longer a dream teetering on collapse. It was a force, and I was standing at its center. My father's silence echoed louder than any insult, and Sophia's downfall was a shadow I could not celebrate. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of stillness, a pause after the storm. Success had come, but so had a reckoning I never asked for. The night stretched before me full of questions about what would come next, yet for now I allowed myself the rare gift of sitting quietly, holding Michael's hand and letting the moment simply be. I walked into a bookstore in Manhattan a few days after the IPO and almost froze when I saw my own face on a magazine cover. The headline read, "The Farmer's Wife Who Outsmarted Wall Street." I picked it up, staring at the glossy pages filled with pictures of me walking the green harvest fields, my hair pulled back in the Iowa sun, Michael at my side. The cashier gave me a wide smile as if I were a celebrity, and for a strange moment I didn't know whether to smile back or hide. The sudden recognition followed me everywhere. Strangers came up in airports to thank me for proving that sustainable farming could be profitable. A young woman in a cafe in Des Moines asked for advice about starting her own business, her eyes shining with hope. Part of me was proud, but another part stayed cautious, remembering how quickly admiration could turn to scorn when things went wrong. At the same time, more rumors about Sophia spread through the business press. I tried not to read them, but it was impossible to avoid. Words like fraud and mismanagement appeared next to her name, and the photos they used showed her looking drained, defensive, almost unrecognizable from the confident sister I once knew. One night, as Michael and I drove back from a meeting, the radio host brought up both our names. They praised Green Harvest's rise, then reported Sophia's downfall in the same breath, calling it a tale of two sisters divided by choices. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the blur of headlights on the highway, my throat tight. It was surreal, hearing my family reduced to a headline, but I knew there was no undoing it. Michael reached for my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "Let them talk," he said softly. "We know the truth." I nodded, holding on to the silence between us, knowing the world outside would only grow louder. I stepped out of the car and stood still for a moment, taking in the old Garcia estate that had once been the center of my shame. The front lawn looked smaller than I remembered, the hedges overgrown, the fountain chipped and dry. Winter air clung sharp against my skin, but it was not the cold that made me pause. It was the weight of memory. Inside, the house felt darker than before. The chandeliers no longer sparkled and the marble floor showed dull cracks. I followed the sound of shallow breathing until I reached the study. Richard sat in a heavy leather chair by the fireplace, his frame shrunken, his once commanding posture bent. His hair was gray, his eyes dim, and for the first time in my life he looked less like a figure of authority and more like an old man trying not to crumble. He lifted his gaze slowly when I entered. For a moment, silence hung between us. I thought of all the years he had belittled me, of the Christmas night when his words cut me in front of strangers. Yet when I finally faced him again, I felt no fire, only calm. "You came back," he said, his voice weak but edged with surprise. I answered, standing tall. "But not for you, for me." His lips pressed together, trembling slightly as though he wanted to form an argument but had none left. The old pride was gone, replaced by something closer to surrender. "They talk about you everywhere now," he muttered. "America's darling, a billionaire." The daughter, I said, was too poor to be mine. I walked closer and sat across from him, studying the lines etched deep into his face. "You were wrong. My worth was never measured by your standards. It was in the love I chose, the work we built, the family we created." He closed his eyes for a moment, and I almost thought he might apologize. But Richard Garcia was not a man of apologies. His silence was the closest thing to one I would ever get. I rose from my chair, my heart surprisingly light. I had spent years carrying the sting of his rejection, yet standing here now, I realized I no longer needed his approval. His defeat was written in the empty halls of this house, in the way he could not even lift his chin to meet my eyes. As I walked back out into the pale Connecticut morning, memories collided with the present. I saw the girl who once wept in this driveway after being cast out, and the woman who now returned with her head high, her family beside her, her company standing as proof of what perseverance could create. Karma had spoken louder than I ever could. My father had lost his honor, while the daughter he once mocked had become a symbol of resilience for an entire nation. Driving away, Michael reached across the console and squeezed my hand, his quiet strength the anchor it had always been. I looked out the window at the bare winter trees rushing past my chest, steady, my voice inside unshaken. To those listening to my story, I want to leave you with this: true worth is never decided by the people who doubt you. It is built in the choices you make when the world turns its back, in the love you choose to honor, and in the courage to keep going when everything tells you to stop. If you have ever been underestimated, humiliated, or dismissed, know that your story does not end there. Believe in your strength, hold tight to those who believe in you, and keep planting seeds even when no one else sees the soil's promise. Because one day those seeds will bloom, and the world will have no choice but to notice. And if my journey means anything, let it be this reminder: never let anyone tell you that you are too poor, too small, or too broken to rise. Family justice and self-belief can carry you farther than pride and power ever will. Now I invite you to reflect. What does true wealth mean to you? And what legacy do you want to leave behind? When I left the estate that day, I drove through the familiar streets of my hometown. The houses looked the same, but I did not. Each corner held a memory, a trace of the girl who once walked here with her head down, afraid of whispers. At the local diner, I glanced through the window and saw faces I used to know. Years ago, those same faces had smirked when they heard I had married a farmer. Now their expressions shifted with recognition, some nodding respectfully, others looking away in shame. I stopped at the cemetery on the edge of town where my mother was buried. The stone was weathered, the grass damp with frost. I knelt and brushed away a few leaves, the cold seeping through my gloves. For years I had wondered what she would think of me, whether she would be proud, whether she would understand the choices I made. Speaking softly into the quiet air, I told her everything. How Michael and I had struggled, how we had built something lasting, how our names now carried a story of perseverance instead of pity. For the first time in years, I felt her presence, not as a question mark, but as a steady warmth in my chest. On the way back to the car, a group of young girls ran past, laughing, their arms linked. One of them paused to stare at me, then whispered to her friend before giving me a quick wave. It was small, but I caught the awe in her eyes, and I realized that my story had become bigger than me. It was now a mirror for anyone who had been told they were not enough. That night, sitting by the fire in our home in Iowa, I opened my journal and wrote down the words I never wanted to forget. Forgiveness is not for them, it is for me. I had not forgiven my father for his cruelty, nor my sister for her betrayal, but I had released their hold on me. Their voices no longer shaped my future. Michael brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me. We didn't speak much because we didn't have to. The silence was rich, filled with years of battles fought side by side. I leaned into him, knowing that everything I had built came from the choice to trust love over fear. And as the flames crackled, I thought about the generations to come, about the girls who would grow up hearing not just my failures, but my victories. The cycle of shame had ended with me. The legacy moving forward would be one of courage, of family, of rising even when told to stay down. 2 years later, Green Harvest headquarters in Des Moines bustled with energy. Screens displayed maps of farms across the Midwest, numbers climbing higher each quarter. Reporters still call it documentaries were filmed, and universities invited me to speak. But when I walked through those glass doors, I never felt like a billionaire mogul. I still felt like the woman who once sold her old car just to keep the lights on. Richard passed quietly the following spring. The news reached me through a lawyer's letter, not a phone call. His estate was smaller than anyone imagined, eaten away by debts and poor investments. Sophia left the country soon after, her name rarely mentioned except in whispers. For a long time, I wondered if I should feel triumphant. Instead, I only felt free. Michael and I stood together one evening, watching our children play in the yard. Fireflies flickered in the warm air, and laughter echoed across the grass. That was the moment I realized the true revenge had never been the money, the titles, or the headlines. It was this life we had built, grounded in love and endurance, untouchable by the cruelty of the past. If my story were to be remembered, I wanted it to be remembered as proof that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you choose and nurture. And that sometimes the sweetest justice is living fully, with nothing left to prove.